Well, thank you very much. What we'll be doing in this section or session is basically having a conversation with each other, and I'll start off by sort of musing a bit, because this has, for me, been a day of feeling, a day of thought, and a day of reflection, and it's quite a lot to take in one day session. So I want to start by sharing a little bit that happened over the weekend for me. I was at a conference with a whole bunch of provosts and academic officers from across the country, several hundred from schools about the size of Schreiner, with similar missions, with similar sort of liberal arts traditions. And we heard a plenary address in which the person who delivered that was a very fine address, but they were basically talking about what schools like Schreiner do, and in terms of teaching students. And what he said sort of hit me in the gut first, and then I had to reflect on it. And he basically said, what we want to teach students to do is to question. We've heard that theme quite a bit today, is to question and to unsettle. And I was expecting more, but he sort of left it there. And the reason it struck me in the gut a little bit is because I'm a provost at a university, and I really am trying to think about how universities can help our society and can help our students, because they are the ones that will help contribute and build the future. And so I got to thinking about, is that all we do? Particularly, and it reminds me of the preacher of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament text, or the Hebrew Bible. There's a time for everything, and it seems like in our current context, when times are unsettling, that is there something else we should be doing too? In addition to questioning and unsettling. And during the end of his conversation, there was a Q&A, and a woman took the mic, and she asked this question, and she was reflecting upon the coming Tuesday's election, and about all the questions about the electoral process, and people questioning the electoral process. And she basically was communicating to everybody something that she wanted everyone else to believe in and to trust. And so I thought that perhaps maybe there's a fourfold question and unsettle. And should we help students understand by at least communicating what we, as representatives, as educators, as citizens, what we do believe in? And then they can scrutinize that. They can either question it, they can unsettle that. But is there some place where we should talk about what we as a country believe in? And on the flip side of that, what we trust. And then they can question and unsettle that. And as I watched the documentary and heard our conversations today, when I sort of prepared my opening remarks, I don't know Spanish, but I do like wordplay, and I do like the humanities. And porvenir, apparently in Spanish, means future. And I think so much of what we're talking about as we're reflecting upon history is we're also talking about the present, and most importantly, the future. Of what do we do with these stories from the past that are unsettling, that not only unsettled back then, but continue to unsettle now? And then what do we do with these stories? I heard many of the panelists representing different perspectives talking about the importance of teaching these things to children, or the importance of what do we do. We heard from family members. One of the descendants that was cited on the documentary, I think she ended up eventually saying, we believe in the Texas Rangers, we believe in the U.S. Army, but she was also struggling with Porvenir and what happened there. What do we do with that? Is that even possible? Do we take her at her word, or was she just double speaking to us? So I hope that in our conversations, what I'd like to sort of start out with is, and any panelist can kind of start with this, what vision would you cast for the next generation? Today on our campus, we had prospective students that were looking at recruiting. And at the same time, we're having a very serious conversation about history and its importance and what we learn from it and how we move on. But I think what's sort of key here is maybe asking you guys the question if there is something that we would want them to understand, not necessarily what they believe in, but what we believe in and what we do trust. The problem with that, as the questioner at that plenary address, I think she was worried that if we don't trust or don't believe in our system of government, don't believe in our laws, that the electoral process, if that falls, we would be in a rather chaotic state. So any panelist that wants to start, I'll actually going to pick on Ben here. I'll do the Ben Montoya. What vision would you cast for the next generation? The reason I want to ask you this question is because I really enjoyed your presentation, but as I'm thinking about what we're doing at Schreiner, if I'm a student in that class and you're talking about which way do you see them, this way or do you see them this way, I'm left with questions, which is great, but what do I do with that? What do you want the student to do? Is it just sort of like, that's way too much information? What sort of conclusions, where should they, what do you do beyond the, yeah, it could be this, you could see them this way or you could see them this way? And then where do we go from there in terms of the future, Porvenir?
Short answer is I don't know. No, I think I think directly for my goal, just when it comes to teaching, is, as I mentioned it towards the end of my presentation, is combating this idea of indifference. So getting students to care, I think, to think twice about some of the history that they're studying. As I say to them, it's the goal of my class is not for them to leave and to think about the history, whatever we're talking about, American Revolution, Mexican Revolution. The goal is not for me to have the students leave my class at the end of a semester viewing it the way I view it, but to really kind of have a more substantial understanding of why they view whatever the situation is, how they've come to that certain conclusion. Now, I realize that's probably not a satisfying answer, because that's still having the student interpret the history the way they want. But in a way, I think that might be enough for the short term for students to understand that so much of history is how we interpret it. But I think, back to, I think the word earlier this morning was reckoning. So I think when it comes to my larger goal is, the nature of racism in American history is really discussed a lot lately around politics. And I think there has to be an honest treatment of how race fits into it, but that doesn't mean we have to be mired in the past of it. One of the many scholars that I've looked at when it comes to this historical empathy bit was this idea that to get away from teaching history as just this constant process of negative outcomes, just this and he's not trying to make light of some very tough episodes in American history, but really trying to constructively bounce off of those difficult moments to say, we're more than just this catalog of oppression, perhaps, of racism. Because I think, as was brought up earlier, maybe it was Judge Wise that brought this up, we're not living in 1923 anymore. We're not living in 1823 anymore. I mean, there has been significant change. There's still a lot of room to grow. But 100 years ago, segregation not only still existed, it was written into law. It was protected by quite a few state governments. And so here we are 100 years later, and that just seems so foreign to us. And so I think to try to not take up too much more time, but to try to encourage that process in which you see what are considered traditional, just quote unquote, the way things are done, actually changing, actually being reformed, being called into question. And as we all know as historians, the only way that starts is by asking the questions first and then somehow fumbling around for the answers. Right.
So this is an unfairly profound question, I think, that we're being asked here, right? And it's really, I think less a question of techniques. How do we learn about the past? How do we ask questions about the past? And less even about what particular conclusions we draw from these events. And clearly, we have some overlap between the panelists and also some disagreement about the questions. I feel like the question that the provost is asking us is one of the stakes, right? What is really at stake when we talk about these episodes? And for me, the through line here is the struggle to create and maintain a democratic society, and to create and maintain it when it's comprised of people of different classes, people of different backgrounds who have different interests, who have different histories, who have different understandings, and who sometimes do terrible things to one another. And in that sense, I think the dilemma of the 19 teens, I take my Tokayo's point, I take Ben Montoya's point that the things are different, right, between the 2020s and the 19 teens, but I think that question is very much still what's on the line for the United States and other similar societies that aspire to be democratic. And I would say, as the sort of history part, right, is to me that an accurate and openly taught history is not enough to have a democratic society. But it's a necessary element for that. You cannot build a democratic society in the 21st century if you're not a country that's willing to reckon with its own past. And in some ways, for as much as the strife and conflict of recent years and recent decades of the United States is lamentable, and we often talk about it as something that we wish would be resolved or could go away and that we could get along better. To some extent, I think we should welcome it, because stories that used to be submerged and kept secret, right, where we have Juan Flores, who won't talk about this even with his own family, are now in public view. They're on public television. They're being discussed openly at universities like this one.
So it sounds like you're saying that we want our students to know that we believe in democracy. So what if a student says, okay, well, we believe in democracy, but we had a democratic society when all these atrocities happened and justice wasn't met, and we want them to have feelings and care about this, but at some point, how do we work against apathy, like it just doesn't matter, the democracy doesn't matter? I think, from my perspective, and this is just my perspective, I think we're at a moment where, because things are so unsettled, if we don't start speaking, and what happens, the trouble with speaking what we believe in and what we trust in is it's open for critique. Someone else can come around and tear it down and tell you why they're tearing it down and why they don't believe in what you believe in. But I'm wondering if there's a sense of, today I was a range of emotions, and I felt like I had empathy and sympathy, and what do I do with that? And then I want to believe in democracy, and I want to believe in laws, but help me understand what we should be. We have an opportunity in universities and in our educational system to address a lot of these issues. But if we think things like, one thing that I hear out of the Texas Ranger narrative is, for better or worse, whether one thinks that it's was achieved or not, but sort of noble law. There's a vision. One reason why stories are created, and we want to set up models of something to believe in or aspire to. And then when reality kicks in, we go, well, how did it work out at Porvenir or some other story? It's sort of like, oh, does that then mean it's impossible? Does that then mean that the myths that form and shape our lives in profound ways, and I don't view myth as something that's not true. I think myth is something that shapes who you are as a human being. So if we believe in democracy, how do we work against students just getting apathetic and saying it doesn't matter anymore and we just live in a world of chaos and everything's unsettled? And then we have at the chief academic officer meeting someone saying, well, our schools should teach to question and unsettle. I think you mentioned the importance of answers, and the problem with an answer is you've opened yourself up to scrutiny. You might be wrong, and that's not comfortable being there. So to question, you almost can find stability in the chaos. That I can question anything, I can deconstruct anything, I feel comfortable there. But what do we do with these stories that we've talked about today in order to tilt us all toward the good?
Well, I really see part of the project of universities and colleges. I mean, we're all about hope, right? I mean, I think no one goes to college without a great deal of hope for the future and in building that future. Otherwise, what's the point? It's expensive, time-consuming, and takes a lot of effort. If there isn't some kind of vision of a payoff, and I'm not talking simply a financial one, then what is the point? Now, but I think that universities and colleges are in the really in the business of combating despair. I think despair, apathy is one form of it, but it takes other forms as well, cynicism, and about the system. I think trust is evidently something that is in short supply all around. We have had decades of profound mistrust in our institutions, including universities, because we, in fact, have examples of how these institutions have failed at many levels. Obviously, we're talking about one specific kind of institution, about law enforcement here, and how one particular instance of that institution has at times failed to live up to its best ideals spectacularly. But on the other hand, I think as long as the criticism is meant to be constructive, right? That is, if we cannot learn from the mistakes of the past, well, the adage, right? We're doomed to repeat it. And so I think there's a real reason why historians and as surrounded by historians, they can speak to the history of this term within U.S. historiography, but the idea of the American experiment, right? It is not, the American perfection. It is the American experiment. That means there are going to be errors. It's not perfect. However, the ideal is that it is also self-correcting, or that is there are mechanisms that its institutions can employ, of which we are part of, in order to ensure something better, if there have been failings. If it's done something right, fantastic. Continue it, adapt it, change it as it needs to. But if there have been failings, well, there are moments of self-reflection upon which we can thereby address those issues.
Is that possible for the Texas Rangers to do that sort of reflection and change and modification over time?
I'm late to the show, and I think I look around and I would need to go doctor, judge, master, and so I kind of wonder what I'm doing here. But I have been fascinated with this particular time of history since I left office back in 2015 and before then, and it started with Porvenir. And I would make a correction on my bio. I'm not the producer of the film. I'm one of many. But what I learned is, and what it reinforced that I already knew, is that history is not black and white, never has been, never will be, and notwithstanding our efforts to make it that way, as was the case in the past, we didn't serve students very well. I'm not a teacher. You are all professors or provo or whatever. But one of the things we should tell students is beware of the pendulum, or be at least aware of the pendulum. And the pendulum in history swings as it relates to academia, in my opinion, with a bachelor's degree. And right now, in my opinion, we've gone from a period of time when the pendulum was way over there where everything was 100% good or 100% bad, Anglo good, Mexicano or Tejano bad. That's where it was. And it was that way for 100 years. And then we began to discover and recognize that we were shortchanging students and everybody else by perpetuating that myth. And it started changing about 40 years ago. I think Porvenir will accelerate that change and realization that there was a very dark period in Ranger history that exceeded any other dark period in any law enforcement history in the state of Texas and maybe elsewhere. And that period was 1910, 1920, the border wars, when people were killed by the fact they had a Tejano name. And Porvenir was the worst example of that, albeit small in the number of casualties when you compare it to the lower Rio Grande Valley. The other thing I would suggest is that we should be very careful of presentism and measuring people today or back then by the standards of today. And my example I use in that, would you think we should have a monument to someone who said, there is no doubt but what Mexicans are a mongrel race, not one of 8 is pure white? Should we have a monument to that person? Or a street named after him? Well, presentism would say no, but that person was Abraham Lincoln, and he said that in 1848 in a debate on the floor of the Congress about the admission of Texas in the Mexican War. So you measure anyone by today's standards, they're going to fall short. And you frankly should also recognize that virtually every Anglo or every white man was racist at a particular time, and the farther back you go, the more percentage of it. And speaking to that end, the gentleman sitting to my right had what I believe to be one of the most insightful comments in the Porvenir movie when he posits that, I like to, I'm paraphrasing, but basically said, I like to think of myself as a tolerant, enlightened man, and I would like to think of myself as a Texan with a heritage in Texas going back to that period of time. I would like to think that if I were there at Porvenir, I would have done something differently. And he concludes, I don't think I can say that. Did I get you pretty correct? Pretty accurate? And you saw the movie this morning. So we all need to recognize that while we think we are really honorable people with good judgment and understanding of history, had we been there, what would we have done? And therefore, we need to look at those characters of that time, whether it's Porvenir, whether it's the Civil War, whatever it is, and look at how they may have differed from their peers who were 100% bought in on white supremacy or racism or whatever, and see those who were outliers who were thinking differently, even if slightly so. I don't know if I answered the question, but.
I think I'd like to go back to that question because you asked the question whether today's Texas Rangers, if they could. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Russell Molina. I am chairman of the Texas Ranger Bicentennial in 2023. And I would say that if you look at the Texas Rangers today, they are who they are because they've learned from the past. And they have adapted to be the elite group that they are. A lot of what was discussed today was all about the bad. There was nothing about the good. that the Rangers have done for the state of Texas. And they've done a lot of good. And the other thing I think that's important to note is that in that 1910, 1920 period, the governor of Texas was one of the most corrupt governors, had fired all the legitimate Rangers, and even in the documentary it talks about they were thugs, the Rangers that were then called Rangers. But I also would like to clarify a couple of other points, if I may, and I do have a couple of questions as well. But when you talk about slavery and Jim Crow, really two separate periods of time. And when you talk about slavery, and it was said a number of times that they went and captured slaves and brought them back. There's no evidence of that. Not one shred of evidence. The Callahan expedition that everybody relates to as being that of going across the border to then to bring back slaves, Thomas McDonald, Texas ranchers and realtors, debunks that completely. So I would like to make sure that the record's clear on the slavery piece. There is no evidence on that. And on the Jim Crow, talking about Captain Banks. So that's the singular event that everybody seems to go to. But keep in mind, while Banks took no action to assist black students in entering the school, which he had, as a state, not federal officer, been specifically prohibited from doing by the governor at the time, he did keep the peace and prevented violence in that place. He even protected a priest who was there to advocate on behalf of the black students. While we today would certainly expect a law enforcement officer to do much more in that sort of situation, such condemnations of Banks are influenced by what academic historians refer to as presentism, judging people in the past by the moral standards of our own time. The other point on Provenir, it was very clear in the documentary that the U.S. Army was present and ranchers were present. But when y'all talk about it, y'all fail to bring those two into the equation and simply talk about the Rangers. Shouldn't it not be including the U.S. Army as well as those ranchers? It also clearly says in the documentary, they don't know who did the killing. Possibly it was Rangers, possibly it was the U.S. Army, possibly it was the ranchers, possibly it was all of them. But I think it's important that full context be told when these discussions are being had. And the other thing that always seems to be out of the narrative is what happened after Provenir when the descendants went on their own rampage and did killings of Anglos. So that's another very important part that I think needs to be part of the conversation when it's discussed. The other thing I'd like to point out, when you talk about wrenches, the fact is that he, in the book that you referenced, very clearly says it was a term that at a minimum applied to all lawmen who operated in the Rio Grande Valley, whether local, state, or federal, and possibly even without regard to their individual ethnicity. So, again, it wasn't being specifically to Rangers, and if you really go back and historically look at where the term came from, it's actually a translation from damn ranchers, because the Hispanic community obviously didn't like the ranchers. So again, I think when you have a conversation like this, it's got to be a little bit colored in a full context and not being myopic and choosing the points that those who would like to make a point for various reasons. And I agree with, no one would justify what happened in Provenir as being something good. Not a modern ranger, nor the rangers at the time. And keeping in mind, they were thugs, as your documentary said as well. But I also heard you talking about that you're going to do this upcoming year, the day, or on this day in Ranger history. I would love to have it where we do it together. Let's sit and have that opportunity to be able to talk about those incidents that y'all are going to bring forth, and let's have a full conversation around that. So make sure that it, again, involves the full context. So as we know, history is complicated, but it also is something that is hugely important we get right, because 13 years later will be Texas's bicentennial.
Thank you. Part of my question, sort of, I think we could take it out of Texas Ranger, and I think at some point in any of our histories, if we go back enough, far enough in our own family trees, we're going to find stories that disturb us. And so the question, I think to the point of, I think everybody here also would say that our democracy is something that we value and that we trust in, even though it's got its flaws and it's not perfect, and it's still a work in progress. January 6th of a couple of years ago, I think was disturbing for everybody, whether you're on the left or the right. If the Capitol House goes down, free market's gone, individual rights are gone, and we're left in a pretty difficult situation. So I guess the question was, I think the narrative of saying we can get things wrong and we can learn from the past and we become better, are there ways in which I think to your point, the Rangers have kind of taken that, sort of understood some of the history and try to improve upon, try to become a more diverse force? The military, police officers across the country, are there ways in which those civic offices can do the same thing we're saying democracy can do? It seems like in our public discourse, we're very critical of places of power, which is, I don't think anyone would disagree with that either. But how do we, if that's gone, you're sort of left with a lot of chaos or anarchy. So I like the idea of, when we talk about problems from the past, letting our students also know that there are ways to correct it. We have a system in place where we correct it. To your point earlier, Judge, we can vote them out of office. We don't have to stay in the same present. We can change.
Yeah, I think these are great questions. I'd like to speak to them in a number of ways. I think that I think we need to be a little bit different in the way that we talk about the idea of change over time, right? And the values of one age versus the values of another. So, for example, you can say that nobody today wants the Capitol to go down or electoral democracy to fail, but that is in fact not true. Otherwise, there would not have been an effort to derail the orderly constitutional transition of power. Although social mores and relative balance of powers and institutions change over time, it is in fact easy to exaggerate the differences, even over long periods of time, in values. So, for example, the critique of slavery on the basis of human equality and human sameness is certainly around in the 1850s, or there would not have been an abolition movement and there would not have been a civil war that resulted in the destruction of the institution of slavery. When Ranger Banks is dispatched by the governor to Mansfield, Martin Luther King is a nationally known figure. It's not an era in which nobody had the idea that segregation was wrong. So certainly as a historian, I'm deeply attentive to ideas of change over time. But the past is not a completely foreign country, or we would not recognize the similarity in these issues and their ties to our own time. I actually want to do something really strange and be optimistic for a moment, and that is going to be by pulling data. And I also
You've just lost us all there.
I want to do something strange and use the word
Optimism
data,
and pulling
right,
data.
as someone who's not a numbers guy. But several years ago, the American Historical Association helped sponsor an in-depth set of interviews and polls of a representative sample of several thousand Americans, as a microcosm of the country demographically in terms of region, education, race, gender, and political orientation, and asked them a set of questions. And so I just want to, and there are some differences that it captures. It captures some of the political polarization that we're talked about, and it captures some of the just doubts that there are at times about the nature of reality, right? Whether there are actually facts that we can agree on. But it actually captures also what may be a surprising amount of consensus. And I already have Jerry very interested in this, I can tell. So, for example, the question, asking people to respond to the statement, teaching the past shouldn't make people feel uncomfortable, even if it was about the harm that it did to others. Or the idea, is it acceptable to teach history about harm done to others if it causes discomfort? A huge consensus exists on this fact, right? About more than 80% of Americans answer absolutely, it is acceptable to teach history about harm done to others, even if it's uncomfortable. Republicans and Democrats answer that question in virtually the same way. To my great surprise also, black and white people answer that question in virtually identically the same way. If you ask people who do they trust as sources of historical information, they give strikingly similar, there are some differences about some institutions, but generally strikingly similar patterns. So I do feel like in that sense, the center holds, right? Or in the sense that we can actually talk to one another and learn from one another and look at events and yes, disagree as we're about to, but actually have a conversation based on some shared commitments and on a shared understanding of what constitutes, proof. I don't want to get, well, we can get into some of the details of Mr. Russell Molina's questions, now and in the future. I can even do some more research on the site. I guess maybe I'll just respond to those questions. I would answer more, but I don't want to monopolize the time here by suggesting that I think one of the things we're seeing as a change, though it's not entirely new, is that I think the Texas Ranger Force and law enforcement in general have lost what used to be close to a monopoly on how these stories and how these histories were told. So my answer to your invitation to cooperate with you on this day in Ranger history campaign is to respectfully decline and to say, we will be putting our own story out there, which will necessarily be quite different and at times starkly at odds with the story that your campaign will. And I think that's part of what a polyglot democratic society looks like, right? Which is actually that you have disagreement and that it's done in the public sphere and it's done by people who can look at one another in the eyes and understand that, we're also in the end on the same team and working for the same kind of society. I have more to say about those specifics, but I think I'll pass it down. Yeah, Ernesto's been very patient for a while.
So mine's going to be I'm going to go back to the word porvenir, which basically means yet to come. And it also has a double meaning in Spanish because most phrases do. And it also means because you came. And right now I'm watching the dialogue and you're looking at it as yet to come in the future, going, we want to work together. They're looking at it because you came. There's this idea that there's this separation that, no, we can't work together because, the ideas are different. But when you look at the people that came here, right, they're looking at the future going, oh, porvenir, our future is yet to come. The Rangers are doing the same thing. The military are doing the same thing. They're looking at it, oh, yet to come. But when they arrived at that point in history, because they came, something tragic happened. And we need to remember that whoever was fully involved, we need to learn from that. And looking at students that come to school, they all come por venir. And it's the professors' jobs, even the museum's jobs, to go, por venir, ahora te voy a enseñar, right? I'm now going to teach you because you came. And that's one of those things that we need to look at. This is a teachable moment. We all have flaws, but everything we can learn from. But again, going to Mr. Molina, I agree with you. There's two sides, and everybody's done a lot of good. A few have done some bad, but we need to look at everything that happens as a whole to be able to tell a full story. And you look at the Porvenir film it's an excellent documentary on that little part, but it would be even better if they branched off into everything else that's happening. But our job is to always remember Porvenir y Porvenir.
I want to just, and this probably be my last, because we got a lot of folks that want to talk, but the getting together and coming up with something you can agree on is really kind of impossible that you can agree on. You can get together and come up with two different viewpoints and posit them at the same time on the same site. However, the problem with doing as Ben wants to do, and others, is that you really leave yourself open to promoting something that is false. And that's why it's always a good idea to talk to people on the other side of the opinion. And for example, you mentioned that descendants of Porvenir themselves did killing and raids, and I'm very familiar with this. I have never heard that. There were raids after Porvenir. The Naval Ranch, very shortly after, was a raid. In fact, this whole thing was a series of raid, retaliation, retribution, raid, retaliation, retribution, in both directions by multiple parties. But I've heard nothing about any of the descendants. They weren't in they didn't have firearms, basically. I mean, one firearm, I think, was found in the camp, maybe on the first time and maybe on the second time.
The men were all dead.
Well, yes, but descendants were living, but most of them were women and children. So it would have been very difficult for them to do that. Now, the other thing, apparently earlier today, we were talking about ranger slave catchers. I've never heard of that. I have no knowledge of it. And you also have to recognize that the term ranger is not only specific to a law enforcement agency in the state of Texas, it's a generic name for ranging company. A lot of people called themselves rangers who really had nothing to do with an organized law enforcement entity in the state of Texas. So, yeah.
One thing that we're starting to get into that I want to mention, and Mr. Molina brought it up, and we're starting to talk about it, is the idea of evidence. You asked a philosophical question, about our institutions and what we believe in and what we should teach students. And I think when you're in unsettled times throughout really world history, certainly American history, I think it's time to go back to what is basic. What is the goal? Well, the goal is that we can all live together, worship how we want, be who we are, different races, different philosophies, but we do all share certain needs, food, water being the basics, but we want to live together and learn from each other and improve our society. So we create these institutions to try to facilitate that. And so I think you got to go from the bottom up and re-examine a lot of the basics and find what we can agree on for sure, but also use these episodes from history to analyze what harms those institutions, what negatively impacts our ability to live together as different people. If there's an incident where law enforcement engages in harm to the citizens in an unjustified manner, that's a problem. And so what is it that caused, what circumstances existed that would enable that to occur? Racial division, perhaps, we've heard about. So why in the world would we ever promote racial division? Well, look around. What are we doing sometimes today in modern America in 2022, unbelievably? Promoting racial division. How does what we see today relate to what existed in 1918? What were the results in 1918? Maybe we ought to be careful of that today. The other thing I'd say is about evidence. Now, I'm lucky enough to work unlucky enough to work in the legal profession, where we have an extraordinarily well-developed body of rules and law to test the integrity of the facts upon which the most important decisions in our society are made, decisions of life, liberty, death, property transfer, who a kid lives with. And so I think some of that probably ought to be applied in the historical context to assess the quality of what we're talking about. You can't ignore half the story and reach a valid conclusion. And if you're doing that, and I'm not saying anybody is, but if you are doing that, you're advocating for something. You're not analyzing history. And so it's easy for me to spot because I'm paid by the state to do that every day, but it's not as easy for our students to spot that. And an example from today, there's been a picture that's been used in more than one presentation. And at the bottom of the picture, it says dead Mexican bandits. That's not all the caption that appeared on the original picture. The original caption is 2 lines. Those dead bodies are from people who came from Mexico, raided the Norius division of the King Ranch, attacked it. It was an armed attack. The attack was defended against, and they lost the gunfight. That's what that picture is. But the implication is, well, these people were just killed randomly. No, they weren't. And so it's false. And so that's an example, fine, you got a picture of dead bodies, but you have to explain the context of what actually happened. And so I think we need to be very, very careful of that kind of thing. And that's something I think that we can talk to those 2 things we could talk to the students about.
Yeah. If I could just jump in just for a second, and then because I've actually been, I want to respond to something you brought up. If we know that with social media, it has the tendency to leave us with disparate conversations. It's not you don't get the whole conversation in social media. We have algorithms that feed us to what we want to hear. And so I almost question whether social media is going to do any good with respect to this. And I see this as a model. If students were to witness the community and people breaking bread together and laughing and being in an uncomfortable environment at times, but students to be able to see how complex it is even to have the conversations, the different people. I mean, when we're in a room together, no one wants to demonize anyone else. It's like, these are good people, and we have perhaps very different opinions. So how do we, if social media, if that's the way, and I know that's not the only way, you guys have, there's a documentary here, but I wonder, to get to the point of what's the sort of lowest common denominator that we can all agree upon as the future we want to move forward, and how do we kind of help students see that, where we're not leaving them up to their own devices, and maybe that's where the hope is, because we're not doing a good job of it ourselves in terms of our generation and previous generations. Sometimes I think we're leaving them with our problems that we couldn't solve. So how, again, pedagogically, what we've been doing has not been working. Let's at least, I think that hasn't, we're still unsettled. So what can we do? And I think this is a moment like this when we're bringing differences, different points of view together, is something that would help students.
We can drink more together, eat more
yes.
together, sit more
Yeah,
together.
and you think about religious traditions. It seems like in our secular space, one thing that leaving some religious traditions out of the secular space, and I'm saying this not as necessarily as a confessional statement, this is more of just what religious narratives, regardless of the religion, did is they gave us language to talk about some of these things. I mean, what we saw on the screen, I grew up in a rural Baptist church. We called that sin. And we don't have that language in the secular space. We don't, a lot of ours like revenge and retaliation, but we also have redemption and reconciliation. And those are parts of the conversation we need to, we see the problem here, but the pourvenir in terms of the future that's yet to come, I'm not sure we actually have that model yet. And I think we have the right people at the table. It's just, how do we get to a future that can bring us together? You think of the secular discourse when we talk about different ethnicities or different hyphenated Americans. Religious traditions tend to neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. They tend to look at that in a very holistic way that's not where it's the lowest common denominator. An earthling just doesn't quite have it, right? We're all earthlings, but that doesn't have the same kind of connection. So I'm looking for that language, that terminology to help us come together.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There's no substitute for face-to-face dialogue and discussion, and I think that's one of the reasons why, all these predictions that people like Bill Gates were making about how universities were going to become superfluous because of the internet, it's quite the opposite, right? There is no substitute for face-to-face education, and that's why I'm an educator, and that's why you work at a place. That's why you work at a place like Schreiner. And if I didn't believe that, I would stop being a professor. And I'm also, quite sympathetic to your idea of the limits of the secular. And, I did not at the outset of my career envision quoting St. Paul in an academic conference, but there's a reason why. I'm doing that. On the other hand, we are also a nation of 350 million people, and these technologies are powerful ways that without owning a broadcasting system, we can reach millions of people with information that I fully expect to be challenged, and in fact have responses to, and that will be laid bare publicly. The Refusing to Forget project really started with all of us understanding both the power of what honest historical scholarship could do, right, which is documented. It is you show your cards through footnotes and sources so that other people can challenge you and correct you and point out when you're wrong. Not that I've ever made a mistake in any of the 350,000 words, rough give or take, that I've published. But we also recognize the limits of that, right? And that's why we turn to things like museum exhibits, and why we turn to things like websites. So I think, even taking into account their limits, they are powerful tools, as I think we all recognize, and in some way. I mean, does Schreiner have a social media presence? Does it have a website? Of course it does, and yet it also pushes people beyond that level of engagement, right, by being the kind of institution that it is.
I'm going to make two more points, and I'm going to shut up because other people need to talk. You mentioned, and I agree about your analogy about Bill Gates and internet taking over higher ed and making it superfluous. I 100% agree. Here's the problem from my viewpoint. If you were to poll the University of Texas History Department as to whether 1836 was all about slavery or mostly about slavery, it would be universally yes. And that is just wrong. There is not a diversity of opinion in university higher education in the history departments today. I don't think there is, and I think there needs to be, and that is a problem. But still, I agree, universities are the place to go. And the other thing I want to make is, we were talking about a few minutes ago, who were the shooters at Porvenir? We did an analysis of the ammunition, a forensic ballistic analysis, and here's a couple of things. First thing we looked at was the expended shells that are 1917 FA 30-06 caliber. That means it's an Army round. FA stands for Frankfurt Arsenal, and so you think it's the Army. However, and this kind of speaks to our sometimes conclusion jumping and all that stuff, we get all dug in certain positions, and then we find out we're wrong. That was the initial conclusion. However, the only lever action weapon that could use 30-06 rounds, because it's a Spitzer pointy nose bullet and it won't fit in a tubular magazine, the only weapon that could use that was an 1895 Winchester. 1895 Winchesters carried by the United States Army using 30-06 rounds. 1903 Springfields carried, correction, I got that backwards. 95 Winchesters carried by the Rangers using 30-06 rounds, and 1903 Springfields using 30-06 rounds. And we know that Rangers were poorly supplied and begged ammo, stole, bought, traded ammo from the Army. So the fact that our first going was, the Army were the shooters. But it turns, I'm convinced, not convinced, I'm like 80% that the Army were not the shooters. Working against the Army was their initial denial that they were even there. And that lasted about 2 days, I think.
Well, we also have great correspondence, which I want to show you, Jerry.
Okay,
later
good.
Today, actually, requests for military ordnance by the Rangers,
Yeah.
by Captain Fox, that were granted. And Captain Fox was, he may have been a thug, but he was a regular ranger, and he was in fact hired again in 2 points in the 1920s and the 1930s by the Ranger Force. So I believe in progress. I certainly think that the United States, like other societies, has become a more humane place in some profound ways, but it's not a sort of automatic, auto-catalyzing chemical reaction. It's because people force those things. And one of the things that needs to happen in this country is that people need to reckon with the history of violence by law enforcement. And with all due respect to Mr. Molina and his points, and I look forward to following up with you, from the way you phrase these things, I don't think you're willing to fully acknowledge that, in fact, the heart and soul and orderly process of the Texas Rangers is what gave us things like Porvenir.
Well, I'd like to just say, Porvenir, again, the Rangers of today don't justify that. So I just think that we need to get off of that whole thing about the existing modern Ranger division does not justify.
I don't think anybody's saying that.
Okay,
at
well,
all.
I'm just saying, but it's just, I mean, but I'd also like to go back to your question regarding how. How do we show the students, or how do we show? I think it's through collaboration. I think through a collaborative effort, that's how we can then have a full conversation so that the points can be put out there, and they may counter, they may be the same, again with Porvenir, that no one's going to argue the fact that that was a horrific event and that it shouldn't have happened or any of that. So, but there are other things that I think that we could benefit from by a collaboration versus one narrative coming out and then another narrative coming out versus having the narrative come out together, and let people then look at what it is and look at the evidence behind it, the factual aspect of it, and have that happen at one time. So anyway, that to me would be a way to have it happen, is through a collaborative effort.
I'll just finish by saying the Rangers and the Ranchers were absolutely categorically the shooters. The Army, maybe not. I happen to lean on the fact on them not being. But David Keller, the archaeologist, leans in the direction of them being among the shooters.
Travis, I have a quick, go right ahead. I'm a journalist, so I probably lie for a living, but just forgive me, please. My name is Louis Amestoy, and that sounds like a very French name. One of the things that's interesting that I want to ask you guys about, we talked a little bit about racial division and some of these things and uncovering the past. Well, I'm not a Texan because I'm from California, but my grandfather was. And he was born in San Antonio in 1919, and his name was Louis Maurice Amestoy. But we also found recently in the last year that when he was baptized in San Antonio, his name was Luis Mauricio Amestoy, because my great-grandfather was from Mexico. And I realized when we discovered that our entire family history was informed by Texas racism throughout the years, which is a hard thing for people to sometimes hear, because my great-grandfather changed his name from Julio to Julius to make it sound more European. And when I was a child, my grandparents said, we're very intentional. They're like, well, no, we're from France. We're Basques from France. But that was not true. My great-grandfather was born in Mexico. He later changed, his name should be Amestoy Lopez, and before he died, they had to change it back to Amestoy and drop the Lopez part of it. Subsequently, on my mother's side, we have a history also informed of Californian racism. My grandmother is a Californio. And when she adopted my mother, she wanted to make sure that my mother had the same racial features that she had, because they weren't allowed to speak Spanish. They didn't learn Spanish in California in that time, in the 1920s and the 1930s. So we only discovered this stuff because of technology, because of the vast amount of information that's now coming to us. And so we have a better idea of our family history through DNA and through other things. So that brings me to my question. We are sitting on the greatest, research tool in the world and talk about collaboration. You guys can all get on the internet and you can look at stuff. My sense of things is that we are just sitting on the beginning of these kind of conversations. They're going to be uncomfortable for years to come. The federal government is tackling right now one of those with Native Americans. My gut tells me that they will find bodies at every Indian school that operated here in the United States. And how do we resolve that? I'm sure the Catholic Church thought to themselves, we are done with this sexual abuse situation, but this sexual abuse situation is going to go back, and there's going to be archaeological evidence to probably support that. So what's next? How do we address that as we move forward into our future? So there you go. Thank you.
Another quick and easy question.
Who wants to take that hot one?
I'll start with an anecdote of sorts. You're talking about fluid identities, and I was reminded of a primary document I looked at preparing for this, and it was talking about, I think it was like in the 1880s, a ranger group coming together to go after Comanche. And what was interesting is that they brought in 3 Puebla Indians to help them find the Comanche. And these 3 Puebla were motivated by the fact that the Comanche had killed, I think it was the father of the main Puebla guide with them. And for someone, who, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, this is the first real time I've dug in deeply with Texas Ranger history, I just thought, how interesting is that? Because when you think of the Ranger identity, you think Anglo-Texans. And I think at that moment, we keep talking about this black and white. Who's right, who's wrong? Who's the Ranger, who isn't the Ranger? And I was like, in that particular instant, just that one instant, the Ranger was this Anglo-Texan as well as the 3 Indian guides that guided those other 15 individuals. So when we're talking about this history of what the Rangers did, what the Rangers didn't do, what they represent, what they don't represent, it's kind of like back to this identity issue. Who were the Rangers? And it was always changing. It's always fluid. Were they just a bunch of ne'er-do-wells, or were they a part of this systematic, comprehensive institution passed down through the generations? Yeah.
On the muster roll, there's over 400 with Latino names.
Yeah.
So it's complicated.
Well, and I think it goes to, I think as Ernesto started his presentation, when you talk about Texas independence, what's often forgotten when it comes to the Texas Revolution is that you had a lot of Mexican Federalists cooperating with Anglos, saying, damn Santa Anna, right? They weren't necessarily, it turns out later, they weren't fighting for the same thing, but in those heady months of 1835, 1836, there's one thing that brought them together, and that was like, we don't want Santa Anna.
Total number of Mexicans that were fighting with the Anglos versus their population, and the Anglo versus their population, the Mexicans were equally as represented as a percentage of their population.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. So that's my humble entree into answering this question from Moses.
My name is Harry Anthony, and I would imagine all of you are native-born Texans, right? Okay, good. I'm not, but I came down here in 1975. That's almost 50 years ago. I'm a damn Yankee. But I remember on that trip down, flying into Corpus Christi, there was a veterinarian from Alice, Texas, and he shared with us, my wife and myself, an incident that he remembers from the mid-1915 or whatever, when the bandits came over from Norris, yeah, right, Norris. And so I came down with basically no preconceived conception about Texas Rangers, about the culture down here. I was kind of just white, just blank piece of paper, but I absorbed everything. I've lived down in Kingsville for 43 years. And so I got to know a lot of people. Some of them, ranch related, and also the common man that I worked with. I guess that maybe this is just a comment, maybe not a question, but when I came down there, I sensed the clash between the cultures right away. And And I think it still somewhat exists. And I've read histories on both sides. I've read from the Hispanic side and from the Anglo side, and I'm sure there's truth to both of them. Getting back to the incidents in Port obviously something had to trigger that, right? There had to be something that occurred south of the border that would result in this.
There was something
outburst.
that triggered it, but it was not related. It was a faux reason for killing people in Port Rainier.
Yeah, and we have Wounded Knee up in North Dakota. We go back in time. I'm sure that every culture, the Irish, the Italian, the German, have been depressed or in some form or fashion, and it's just human nature, right? What I'd like to see, though, is that we get this dialogue, we come together, and we move on. And I don't know if assimilation is possible, but when you keep your separate identities, this hyphenated American, I'm German, English, and whatever else, right? But I don't go around and wear it on my sleeve. I'm an American. And hopefully the future we can talk about these things and move on instead of living in the past. So anyway, if you have any comments, thank you.
Well, I think we all want to work towards a goal where individuals are respected in their rights and recognized for the capacities. I think that is absolutely an ideal. And also that communities are as well, whether they're ethnic or linguistic or perhaps other forms of communal identification and religious. There are all sorts of axes of identification that are operative in everyone's everyday lives. Some are more important than others, right? And that can also change over time. So absolutely. As to your comment, it kind of reminds me of my daughter, who is now 14 but was born in 2008. 2008's actually a really important moment. One, of course, is that's when the first iPhone came out. Okay, so she's a digital native in that sense, or the smartphone, right? The second thing is that, of course, that is the year Barack Obama was elected U.S. president. Okay, and so come 2016, right? She's 8 years old, and we talk about the election that is underway at that time, and she's like, I guess I can imagine a white president, right? I can imagine a white president because, of course, white president was outside of her historical experience at that moment. So really, I think the point of that is really that the kind of frame of reference that we're approaching, many of these issues and concerns. I think for us in Refusing to Forget, correct me if I misspeak, Ben, but really we're seeing it not as a kind of narrative, narratives that emerge on a level historical playing field, right? But rather narratives in which one has had, been enshrined for at least 60 years in popular mass culture, and even before then in academic culture, and an emergent one, right? Which you haven't seen. How many shows and series have you seen that have provided the perspective that Refusing to Forget wants to bring to the table? I'm not saying, in other words, I'm not saying that it's a historical interpretation. obviously, and should be judged by that on the kind of professional kind of basis. On the other hand, it's also an emergent narrative. It's not one that has been enshrined and mythologized for decades. So, it's really hard to kind of see how, that, somehow we're upending the entire apple cart by saying what we do. So I'm just going to say, put it into perspective, right? From our angle, these are narratives that are brand new, they're emergent, they are emerging out of the institutions that I think have historically served as part of the self-correction and self-reflection mechanism of our democracy. And so, in other words, a kind of one of those attempts to encourage that self-reflection beyond the confines of the institution itself.
Thank you. We're really at time right now, but I want to ask a question. We'll do it a rapid fire question down the panel here.
This better be an easier question
well,
than the other questions you've asked.
And I want to let everyone know I did not prepare them with the questions, so I think there's a lot of honesty and authenticity.
As you can tell.
Yeah. So I don't want to waste the opportunity here because we have a lot of good people here that have a lot of different ways of looking at problems that we all care about and all care about the future, the porvenir. I'm a student, and what's one thing you could tell me that is a step in the direction toward a future in which you have the different sort of discourses that we've heard today exchange, different sort of perspectives. And I don't think we've just had two. I think we've had multiple perspectives in the room. But what sort of hope do you give that student in about a sentence or two about where do we go from here? I've listened to you all. You've told me good things. I don't know what to do with it. I feel emotions. I feel horrible things have happened in the past. But what do I do with that? What would be your response to that student if they came up after class? What do I do with that? Ernesto, I'm going to put you on the spot, and we're going to start on your end because you're probably more adept at this working at the Alamo and having maybe similar questions.
I would tell the student, first of all history is connected. History is not good or bad. That's not the way to look at things. But I would always say, if you continue to learn from the past, you're less likely to repeat it. And things always get better. There's always a silver lining, and that's what you should always look at. You should look at the fact that there's something ahead, or algo por venir. And you should always look to the future. In our world, we study the past in order to do that better, but students should always look to the future. Don't hang out in the negative world, because that's basically what's happening now in cyberspace. People are brave behind a screen, but more open to talk in public, have an actual dialogue. There's not an argument, as we've seen today. And I would just tell them to, one, keep an open mind and always look to the future, because things only get better.
Well, the question was, how do you give them hope? And I'm not really interested in giving them hope. I would like to give them direction. And the direction I would give them is get out of your comfort zone, get out of your cocoon. Don't hang with like-minded people solely. Don't read things from like-minded sources, because nobody's got it completely right. And that's what, as I alluded to earlier, concerns me about history in university education right now. There's one viewpoint.
I'm going to follow up. I'm the student. I'm going to follow up with that. Okay, this discussion did exactly what you just asked. I'm unsettled. You've just given me direction. Do more of that. Is there anything that I can look forward to
Yeah,
that
if you
gives
follow
me-
my directions, you'll be more knowledgeable than you would have was otherwise.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe make a better grade in your class, right?
I thought you were going to tell them to take one of my classes, but I'm devastated that you didn't make that move. I guess if I can boil it down to a sentence, it would be learn your history and use it as a tool for the future that you want for yourself and the society in which you live.
I would kind of say, like, get involved, in order, get informed, get engaged, and get involved. Really, I think that is. I think there is a tendency, particularly. I mean, we talked about social media, the impact of social media, for extreme atomization, and kind of those algorithms work stunningly well. They've really refined algorithms to pinpoint exact demographic information, or to match demographic information to potential consumer interests. And so, so I think getting beyond, I mean, not only the comfort zone in general, but specifically the social media comfort zone, getting outside that and have these, more in-person interaction, more willingness to engage, right, and to broaden one's horizons.
I think 2 points. So
Be careful, Ben, because you teach here.
Yeah, I know. I think so ancient Mesoamerican people tended to view the circle, there's their cycle of life in circular terms, right? Speaking, getting biblical, right? They had their equivalent of you come out of dust and you return to dust, except they talked about it in terms of corn, in terms of you come out of the earth, you come out of corn, and you return to it. That's why even just a cursory glance at Mesoamerican culture, there's this, fascination is the wrong word, but there's this comfort, there's this deep connection to death, because death is not an end, death is a process. And so I think my first thing that I would say to the student is, by contrast, I think Europeans brought over this idea that history moves linearly, that it's always kind of getting better. And I would caution students to think, linear only works as well as, I'll get to my second point, only works as well as you work to make that happen. Travis has heard this bit, so he'll maybe roll his eyes at this, but you guys won't. So I've really become interested in a psychologist, a guy named Alfred Adler, who was of the generation of Sigmund Freud, and he was interested in this thing called social interest theory, where he basically said, we all coexist together. Society only progresses when we cooperate together. And there's no net neutral. If you don't cooperate together, then there's a negative. So you have the choice of whether you cooperate and things improve, and if you don't cooperate, things could go worse. But there's not going to be this, things aren't just going to keep going. It's either going to go like this or it's going to go like this. And so that's what I would say to my students. And as I said before, I don't try to inculcate them, but I think what I would encourage them to do is to think about you have a tangible role, you have agency, which all of us, it's a big magic word for us as historians. What is your agency? What is a person's past? What's their agency? Students have agency.
I have not read Adler. Adler,
yeah.
But what I was going to say is very Adler-esque. I would tell the student that Texas, since we're in Texas, has always worked better when we work together and when we find what we have in common and we build on that. And so I would say the best of Texas is a result of that cooperation. So learn your history and discern the lessons that lead to cooperation and unity and embrace those, and discern the lessons that lead to division and strife and shun those. And the same for narratives. Take the narratives of unity, cooperation, even if the lessons are difficult, and find a way to work together. And take the narratives that preach division and difference and shun them. That's what I would say.
I think that's a good way to... Yes, you may share.
I've been recording the speakers, so I got guess how tall I am. All right, my name is Armando Medina. I'm from Brownsville, Texas, kind of. I was born in Minnesota, but I've been there since I was about 3. Hello? Is that fine? Yeah? All right. I'm going to use my phone because I'm kind of all over the place all the time. So I'd never heard about any of this, surprisingly. And as we were watching the film, I went down a rabbit hole of Wikipedia pages, just kind of figuring out names, who's what, who did who. And I'm kind of bothered by that because I'm from Cameron County, Brownsville, right? And a lot of the stuff went down there, you know, like the first bandit war or infiltration raid, whatever, happened there. So I'm kind of bothered because I feel like they're trying to keep me from my reparations check. But at the same time, should I be bothered? Like, should we teach that stuff? And I know that that's kind of been an ongoing topic, but it got me thinking about, and my teacher's a first grade, my girlfriend's a first grade teacher, so if she were here, she'd back me up on this, but kids are innocent, you know? Racism isn't instilled until it's taught or until you hear about it. So, for example, I didn't think of Texas Rangers as anything until I saw this. And now, naturally, I'll think of this whenever I see or hear of a ranger. It's like if I said, quick, don't think of an elephant. You know what I mean? So should we teach that stuff? And it goes back to history repeats itself, right? You got to learn it to prevent it. But if you learn it, you also kind of learn it, you know? So let me see if I wrote anything else. Yeah, like I put, a dog is a dog until you know a pit bull from a golden retriever, you know? So humans are humans, so you know he's black, I'm Hispanic. I don't know. Is that a good statement? Did I do it?
I think that's, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very powerful question.
Yeah, I learned a lot today. Thank you.
You're asking a question about you're not aware of something. You're not aware of even how to see someone else or an institution until you're aware of it. And a certain lens, if you're only looking at a certain lens, it might color that interpretation of an institution or a person or an event. So I'm going to take the advice of, even though I challenge this a little bit, but I'm going to end us with that question of, you know, sometimes stories that we carry with us, I mean, they do shape us, but we've got to be very careful about the sort of interpretations that we bring forward, and probably, I've heard the panelists say this, let you also know that the way they look at the world is an interpretation of it too, whether it's historical or not. There was one statement in the documentary that and it was an archaeologist, but what was the statement? He said, these artifacts don't lie, they tell the truth. And I like this statement, but there was a little bit there, yeah, but they don't speak either. And so there's a little bit more of a complication about taking facts from the past. There's always an interpretation.
Those artifacts are facts.
Mm-hmm.
They don't lie that they're facts, but they're not all facts.
Yeah, and they also don't speak. So,
We wish we had more artifacts.
yeah. Well, I want to say thank you to our panelists. One, for modeling civil discussion, for providing a little bit of that collaborative hope that we were talking about toward the end here. I think there has been collaboration today. I hope that we've all heard from each other. I do know that I've got a lot, this has been a heavy day for me. It's not been a light day in terms of taking in what we've sort of discussed. But would you in the audience please join me in thanking our panel. And I will now hand it over to our host, Dr. Fraser.
Thank you, Travis, and thank all of you guys for being part of this. Thank y'all for coming and asking good questions. This is an important process. This is an important day. And I think that it's, I've been blown away by what I've learned today, and I appreciate the gift that has been to me, to this institution, to our students. Armando is a fresh grad from Schreiner, but he was all of a sudden moved by, wait, I don't know what I don't know, and now I know what I don't know, and I wish I knew what I did know. So when you have those sorts of events happen, you know you're doing something right. And so I look forward to facilitating in any way through the Texas Center. If there's any way we can be of service to anybody here on this panel, in the audience, that's what we do. And so that said, we've done some heavy lifting today. So it's probably time to set that aside for the day. And let's go have a convivial gathering that, yeah, that's right. Well, let's do some more heavy lifting. But let's do that as friends and colleagues. And I look forward to traveling this road with y'all together. Por venir.